the board of the company. But in addition to that, he was also the chairperson of the board tender committee. And I had obviously, with me being, before I was appointed as the financial director of the company, I was also chairing the Eskom procurement of the company. So therefore, I had several engagements with him in preparation for the board tender committees on various occasions. So my relationship with him was about discussing what would be presented before the board tender committee on recommendation from the Eskom procurement committees. And therefore, I continued the relationship with him going forward. I think suffice to say that during that time when I was the procurement chairperson and he was the board tender chairperson, the relationship was fair, really. There were no issues. Issues started when he became the acting CEO, to my knowledge. Yeah.
Who was the chairperson of the board that you served in?
Please repeat that.
When you became a member of the board, the non-executive director, who was the chair of the board?
The chairperson of the board was Mr. Zola Tsotsi.
We heard yesterday that amongst challenges that Eskom had faced in and around 2014 related to the financial position of the company. And you were appointed in the midst of that challenge. What was your responsibility?
My responsibility, obviously having taken over from the predecessors, because the issues of the company's financial challenges had been ongoing, since we had obviously applied for a tariff application and we received lower than what we had anticipated, and the operational challenges were becoming more and more, and therefore because of that we had some financial issues that we had to deal with. So my first obviously my first initiative was to make sure that we put in place a long-term financial sustainability plan in place, presented to the board strategy session, which took place around April 2014, and then presented to the shareholder for consideration. And it really contained issues around how do we make sure that as a company we get support from government, really indicating that the tariff increases that we had received were not sustainable, but secondly that we had challenges from an operational perspective side, which in themselves were creating some financial issues, and I think it has been said publicly around the issues of generation maintenance and so forth, and also we had to put in place as a company a program that we called the Business Productivity Program for cost-saving initiatives, so that we could obviously be able to survive and make sure the company is sustainable. So we presented the plan to the board strategy session in April under the chairmanship of Mr. Zola Tsotsi, and the committee then obviously looked at the plan, and they were concerned that it was not adequate to get us out of trouble. In their view, from the chairman himself, said that we need a more robust plan, which we need to give to the Minister of Public Enterprises in 3 months' time, which would have been around June 2014. I then, the chairman of the interim CEO, in fact, then requested that we be allowed time to work together and review our plan. And we then had a meeting with him to discuss the way forward. He then requested that we should actually bring people in to come and help us with the financial sustainability plan. And we then had a meeting over the weekend, because clearly it was urgent, there was no time to waste, so that we could then on Monday provide the chairman with a plan going forward. What in fact struck me was that in the meeting that we had over the weekend, he suggested that we he knows people that can help us with our financial sustainability plan. In my questions around what sort of help would they give us, he indicated that they had done some work in Transnet, in SAA, and I think the city of Johannesburg or City Power, if I'm not mistaken, regarding balance sheet optimization. While we were sitting there, a gentleman joined us, who I didn't know. I had actually met him before, and was introduced to me again, and his name is Salim Essa. And the question of how we then take the matter forward in terms of the financial sustainability plan was discussed. He was then asked, Salim was then asked to tell us which company would help us. And he indicated that Regiment's Capital would be the company that had done good work in Transnet, in SAA previously in terms of balance sheet optimization. So I listened to obviously what would be the way forward. We were then asked to have a meeting with Regiment's Capital as soon as possible. And having not met Regiment's Capital before, we had worked with various financial services advisors, even before my time, my predecessors. I had not heard of Regiments before. So we open to everyone that comes to us and want to help. So a meeting this was on a Sunday when we met. A meeting was then convened for the following day to have a discussion with Regiments in terms of how they could help Eskom to sort out the financial sustainability plan. In the meeting, Mr. Eric Wood, who was the CEO of Regiment Capital, came to the meeting himself. I can't remember if he had anyone else. I think he had one other official with him. Representing Eskom was myself, Mr. Dr. Steve Lennon, who had been asked by Colin Machila to join us. We then had a meeting with them, and really the purpose of the meeting was first to establish what does the company do, how do they think they can help us, how do they think they can help us, and do they understand the challenges that the company is facing and how big the balance sheet of Eskom is. We then asked them if they had done any work previously, and they did say that they have previously worked on a Euro bond in 2005 with Goldman Sachs for Eskom, which both myself and Steve Lennon were not aware of. We then asked them, given the size and magnitude of the Eskom balance sheet, do they think they have the capacity to be able to assist us? They then indicated that they normally do not work alone. They would actually partner with McKinsey in most of the contracts that they have done. Mr. Machila then asked them to prepare a proposal for us, which would then consider and come back to them. After the meeting, I then went to Steve Lennon to ask Steve Lennon, what do you make of this? Have you heard of these people, this company? And he said no. And we talked about the procurement process, and I said, no, we are going to have to follow a procurement process, and I will speak to Mr. Machila on that. I then went to Mr. Machila's office immediately, and I said to him that we have to follow our procurement process. I do accept that we probably need a robust financial plan, if that's what the board requires, if that's what the minister requires. However, there are other financial services companies that have been lining up for work at Eskom, and that would have to follow a very fair and transparent process. He then, in his response, said to me that, unfortunately, we are not going to do that. We are going to go with Regiment's Capital because Eskom is known to have appointed financial service advisors in the past, and whatever efforts has been put in place had not yielded any results. And he said to me, it is an emergency. As we heard from the board, the board would like a plan to be presented to the minister in a few months' time. I said, it is an emergency. We need to check the emergency procurement process of Eskom. It is clearly defined what an emergency is. I believe that it is an urgent matter. However, there are ways of taking it through a closed procurement process so that it is fair and transparent. He then said, I can see you uncomfortable with this matter. If you are not comfortable, I will sign the agreement with Regiments. And that is when the meeting my meeting with him stopped. Mr. Colin Machila, the interim CEO.
Okay. Who introduced you to Mr. Salim Issa? Is it Mr. Tsotsi or Mr. Machila?
I actually met as I indicated, I met Mr. Salim S, and at that time I didn't know who he was as well. Very early after my appointment, I was called by the Chief of Staff, I think he is the Chief of Staff of the Minister at the time, Mr. Nhlanhla Msomi, where he had asked to speak to me, having been appointed as the Finance Director of the company. He indicated to me that there had been complaints previously about Eskom not transforming from a procurement perspective, and that they hope that, obviously with me being appointed, I understand the transformational objectives of the company, and that Eskom as a state-owned entity needs to make sure that they accelerate transformation. I indicated to him that it's always been a strategy of the board that we will obviously drive transformation in the company, and it has been the case for a while. He indicated to me that it was Minister Malusi Gigaba. Yeah, but it was the Chief of Staff that I met with. He then indicated that there are suppliers currently that are complaining that Eskom is, black suppliers that are complaining that Eskom is not providing them with contracts, and they would like to meet and just lay their complaints. I indicated to him that I no longer chair the procurement committee. We do have a chief procurement officer, and I believe that those issues should be directed there. However, I do not have issues with meeting with people and then directing them to the right levels. He then said to me that he will make arrangements for me to meet the suppliers that are complaining. When I met the supplier, it was Salim Essa. And when I asked him what company he works for, he did not divulge the company. He said there are various companies that have been trying to do business with Eskom, and they have been turned back. And he, in fact, complained about my predecessors that they always went for white companies. And he said in their case, they have seen results, and they always work with McKinsey, and that's what he said to me. So when I met him for the second time, I was being introduced to him then by Colin Machila. That's when I realized that I have met him before, yeah.
The meeting in April of the board, which was not happy with your financial sustainability plan, where a suggestion for an external service provider to assist you with the plan came about. Had it ever served before the then minister for his or her consideration?
It was, remember that at the time we were going through a transition. We had, I think at the time, Minister Lynn Brown was being appointed as the Minister of Public Enterprises. But my predecessors had previously presented strategies to the board, which then the board presented to the Minister of Public Enterprises, which would have been Malusi Gigaba previously. So I guess the issue was the transition into the new minister, that the board needed to apprise him with what was happening in terms of the appraisal, with what was happening in terms from a financial sustainability, but also the operational challenges as well.
So in your understanding, the individual or individuals who are unhappy with your financial sustainability plan was your board?
So the discussions was around, is it robust enough? The chairman, Zola Tsotsi himself, said that he believes that we need a more robust plan, and the minister is not going to be happy if we cannot provide that plan in 3 months' time. So we need to go back and look at what else needs to be done. There were rigorous debates within the board around what the challenges were. And really, I think the board was really trying to apply its mind as well, because you had various other members of the boards other than Mr. Tsotsi and Mr. Machila. Yeah.
What was urgent about procuring these services?
The issue that we were faced with, and it's really about the agency of procuring the services, but we had been saying for a while that we have financial challenges. It was important for us to settle those issues, because those issues had been going on for a while since the MYPD3, the tariff determination of 2012, 2013. So it was important for us that we have an engagement with government on how we move forward in terms of the funding requirements of the company. One of the challenges we had was that we obviously were highly geared as a company. For us to be able to go out to the market to seek borrowing, we obviously needed to have also cost-reflective tariffs, which would obviously back up our revenues. So what was important was that because we knew that we did not have very good financial metrics, we needed support from government to understand what are some of the options that we have. Are we going to get equity, or do we have additional guarantees from government so that we can go out to the market? Is there any possibility of additional tariff adjustments so that we could be able to meet the operational requirements? And of course, we had quite a huge bill program, which obviously was one of the reasons that we needed to make sure that we have the funding needed.
The Monday meeting, you left each other when Regiments was to furnish you guys with a proposal. What happens then?
After we left, they had said that they would obviously put together a proposal on what it is they believe they can help us with. In my discussion with Colin, I said, if it's an emergency, you need to tell them to give it to us in less than 5 days. And however, what happened is that they came back to us within 14 days, if I remember very well, because one of the things I raised when they sent their proposal, in fact, they did not send a proposal, they sent a draft agreement of what the nature of the services they would provide is, what the pricing and the terms would be. And that was sent within 14 days. I actually wrote an email to Mr. Machila because they sent me the agreement. And I said to him, it is on this basis that this does not constitute an emergency. They have taken 14 days. In terms of our procurement process, if I recall, we could request suppliers or service providers to give us responses within 14 days on an urgent basis. And therefore, this did not constitute an emergency. He then, I sent him an email and I said, I copied the head of legal then, Mr. Neo Tsolangu, and I said, I suggest that Mr. Neo Tsolangu gives us his opinion on how we move on this matter. I then forwarded the agreement to them. He then called me in the evening and reprimanded me for putting such messages on email and asked for a meeting. We then had a meeting the following day, and he felt that he was not being supported. He's got a mandate from the shareholder and the board that certain things that need to happen urgently, and we don't have time for wasting, we don't have time to waste with our long-winded procurement processes. And I said to him, as the acting CEO of the company, he is within his every right to go back to the board and ask them to amend the delegation of authority if he felt that it was impeding on us to deliver on time. He then said that he would do no such thing. I then gave him the agreement. After I had given him the agreement, legal looked at it. Legal did not make any major changes to it. They then printed it for signature. I then left it in his office for his signature, as he had indicated that he's going to sign the agreement. After I had done that, I remember that I had a meeting with my team, a strategic session at our Eskom Academy of Learning. He called me and said to me, I need to sign the agreement. I said to him, I'm not going to sign the agreement based on our previous discussions. I think he feels that we need to do this work. Having not followed process, he has to sign the agreement. He then threatened to say that he's going to bring a driver over to me so that I can sign the agreement. I said I will do no such thing. He asked me to put it in writing and give my reasons why I would not sign the agreement. I did that. I put it in writing, and what I did is when I sent it back to him, as well as the chairman of the board, as well as 3 other members of the committee of the board, who were chairpersons of subcommittee members. I think if I recall, it would have been the chairman of the investment committee. It would have been the chairman of the social ethics and sustainability, and I think the chairman of the audit committee. A couple of days later, Mr. Tsotsi then called a meeting based on the email I had sent, wherein I provided why I was not comfortable with signing the regiment's agreement because we had not followed process. And in the meeting, I got support from other board members that because we had not followed process, because when you look at this agreement, the pricing terms is not competitive. It would appear that we should have followed process, and that although this is urgent for the minister to submit to the minister, it would appear that we have not defined clearly if a financial sustainability program would be a part of the definition of an emergency. The board then said that because, and the minister, the chairman of the board, in fact, if I remember vividly, was actually not happy with me as well. He said that we're busy wasting time with long-winded procurement processes, and heads are going to roll if the minister does not receive the financial sustainability plan in June.
Yeah, just give us the name of the chair and the chairpersons of the various committees that served in the task team.
The chairman of the board was Mr. Zola Tsotsi. The chairman of the investment committee, who served as also a member of the task team, was Mr. Mafika Mkwanazi. The chairman of sustainability was social ethics and sustainability was Dr. Boni Mehlomakulu. And the chairman of the audit committee was Ms. Bajabuli Lelutuli.
As a finance director, you must be familiar with the regulatory framework around procurement. Let me remind you, it is the Constitution, Section 217, it is the PFMA, Treasury regulations, and the policies of an institution. Is that correct?
That is correct.
In your testimony, you have referred to both the then chairperson, Mr. Tsotsi, and the then acting CEO, Mr. Machila, as people who have absolute disregard for the laws governing the procurement processes. Is that understanding correct?
I would say yes, and one of the reasons for that is that when I sought legal opinion from Neo Tsolanku on the specific matter, he actually quoted Section 217 in the memo that I had presented, indicating what the requirements of Section 217 are and under what circumstances could one be exempted from following Section 217. that memo itself served, that's the memo that in my memo I quoted his legal opinion, and I sent it through to Mr. Tsotsi, to Mr. Machila and the 3 board members that I mentioned. And because even having received that in writing, the chairman, Zola Tsotsi, indicated that we are wasting time with long-winded procurement processes, suggests to me that he had no regard of those procurement regulations.
The proposal that you got from regiments, you said there was a fee structure. How much were they going to charge Eskom?
So maybe just to step back, in their agreement, in their proposed agreement, what they were proposing to do is a number of initiatives for the company in terms of how we unlock cash on the balance sheet, such as the sale of non-core assets, the sale and leaseback as a possibility, and how one of the very big initiatives that they had suggested was monetization of coal contracts. And they had made certain assumptions around what the current value of the coal contracts that we have as Eskom was. They had made certain assumptions around what the expected tons of coal would be required over the next 50 years, and therefore came to the conclusion that the present value of those contracts was really essentially undervalued, and they believed that we could work with one of the financial services providers through themselves to actually seek funding through those contracts. And we were opposed to that because, first of all, the contracts do not necessarily belong to Eskom. You do have coal mine. It's a contract between ourselves and coal miners. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we could not attest to the assumptions that they had made in terms of the price of coal, the current price of coal, and what the future price of coal would be, and also what the volumes that Eskom would require in the future. When we looked at it with the primary energy department, we felt that it did not make sense. They had suggested that out of that, we would probably save the company 10 billion rand. And their fixed fee structure was on an escalating basis, such that if they obviously were able to, even though it was a risk-based fee structure, they were quite confident that they would be able to save us 10 billion rand, and the fees that they would obviously charge would be up to 250 basis points, which when we looked at it was quite substantial and close to about 500 million, if my calculation is correct here.
I just want us to conclude on this agreement or this proposal. Where does it end? What transpires of it? Do you eventually get to approve that they render the service? If so, who authorizes that you could enter into an agreement with regiments?
What we did in the end is that we did not authorize, the board did not authorize the agreement after I had sent the memo to them. They, however, said that we need to do a high-level desktop exercise to understand whether the initiatives that regiments was presenting us, whether they were viable or not. So a high-level desktop exercise was done on the basis that we had run out of time. The minister was asking for a plan in a few weeks' time, and we had not even done that, other than the plan that I had prepared with my finance team. And therefore, the board felt that we could probably do a high-level desktop exercise, which actually cost us about 800,000. I then insisted that the board should actually approve that, even based on the fact that we had not gone through a commercial process. on the basis that if that's how the board felt, it is urgent, it's understandable, I still need a mandate in writing. So we then prepared the documents, and the board was happy to approve that on the basis that let's do a high-level desktop exercise and understand what are these initiatives, because it could be that they're coming up with initiatives that we have not explored previously and could benefit us.
As a finance director, having done the desktop or allowed them to do this desktop exercise, you sat with a product that came from regiments. What value, if any, was that result to Eskom?
I would say very little. The reason for that is that they then had to show us how this initiative would work in practical terms. We went through, if I recall, I think there must have been 10 or 15 initiatives that they put on the table. Just a number of them, we said that they are not viable and they would not be unlockable, and one of them being the coal contract monetization. Some of them, such as the sale and leaseback, we had already explored in the past and therefore felt that we could not continue with them. Others we were already doing, because even before my time, as I indicated, that my predecessor had started a process at looking at what initiatives could we do to unlock cash on the balance sheet. And on recommendations that had been done previously, some of the initiatives that they had suggested were already in progress by the team in finance. So there was very little that we took over from them. It was really an issue of let's confirm whether we are not missing anything. Let's make sure that everything that has been presented here, and if I recall back, and I probably don't remember everything, but there was probably one or two that we probably overlooked. But you have to take it through a process to see if it's implementable or not, and practical for business to do. So that the high-level desktop exercise was really just a high-level initiative. For each one of those, you actually had to unpack them within the business and obviously do a risk assessment of each one of them and see if they could be done or not. At the end, after we had done that, we found that very little could be done from what they proposed.
My second last question relates to the New Age deal. I think there's evidence before the committee, and I wouldn't want to burden you further with evidence as before the committee. You did not sign the New Age deal. You refused. I want you to just assist the committee understand why you wouldn't sign that deal. Secondly, I would like you to take the committee through how the board dealt with the Sizwe and Saluba Koboto report.
In terms of the New Age deal, it was under the ambit of our corporate affairs department, led by Chose Chwewu, who reported to Erica Johnson. When the matter came to their attention, they obviously had to look at whether we had budget for that or not, whether there was a need in the company to be able to do such a deal. They had a discussion with me to say, we've been asked to do this, we don't think we have budget for it, and one of the problems we have is that we have not had a policy in the past on this matter. We're in the process of drafting a policy for the board to approve so that we could decide from a sponsorship and others' perspective what it is that the company could do and not do. When we looked at the budget, we found that we had very little budget. In fact, we had cut budget quite extensively and probably had, if I recall, 12 million left of the budget for the year. And thereafter, we had decided that we would not do any more sponsorship given the financial challenges that the company was going through. We then agreed on that basis with Erica Johnson as my colleague. And that's where I left it. The next time I saw it was when I was sent an email with a contract when it had already been signed, and it had been signed by Mr. Machila himself. It had been witnessed by two of our executives, Mr. Freddy Ndou and Mr. Chose Chwewu. In fact, it was Mr. Chose Chwewu who sent it to me, and it had already been signed on the other side by the third party, the TNA officials. So when I then received it, I sent an email, a response to them to say, I'm not sure if you are aware that Mr. Machila cannot sign a contract of 43 million rand on his own, because what has happened is that it should have gone through a process of approval as the chief executive. Obviously, he was acting. And I copied Mr. Machila on the matter to say, I think you should have advised him that in terms of our delegation of authority, he does not have the delegation to sign this contract. Mr. Machila then called me to say, I'm aware of what I have signed, I have a mandate, the same story that he told me with Regiment's Capital. And I said to him, look, you do not have the delegation of authority as the chief executive to sign a contract of this size. My suggestion is that we present this to the board so that the board can decide whether they want to ratify the contract or not. He said to me that he is not going to do anything like that. I then spoke to our legal counsel at the time, Mr. Mohammed Adam, regarding it, and he had informed me that he was aware of it. He had been pushing back on it simply also because the contract was signed in such a way that it had no exit clause. So it was a 3-year contract for 43 million rand with no exit clause. So he was concerned about the legal implication for Eskom as well, and that he had already had a discussion with the chairperson of the audit committee on the matter. On the same day, I happened to have a meeting with the chairperson of the investment committee, Mr. Mafika Mkhwanazi, on the matter. And he did not sit in the audit committee, if I recall, but he did indicate that he is aware of it and the board will be starting an investigation. He has requested that the company secretary consult with Koboto Forensic Investigation to start the investigation on the matter. The matter was investigated, and during that time we were also preparing for our half-year interim results. And our auditors were Sizwe and Zaluba Koboto. So obviously the Koboto forensic report indicated that there was obviously wrongdoing on the part of Mr. Machila. When they look at our procurement processes, he should not have signed a contract of this nature on his own without taking it through the proper governance structures. They then started to seek legal action on the matter. And by the time that happened, I think Mr. Machila obviously stepped down as the acting CEO, and Mr. Tsidiso Maduna came in. And he obviously reverted, Mr. Machila reverted being a board member. So the legal opinion, if I recall, indicated that gave some options to the board in terms of what they could do, because Mr. Machila was no longer a member of the executive committee. There was very little recourse in terms of disciplinary measures, and therefore they needed to explore whether they want to take criminal charges against him or whether they wanted to claim the amount that had been procured with TNA, or even and also report the matter to the minister. I'm aware that the chairman of the audit committee tried on several occasions to engage with the Minister of Public Enterprises, but I'm not sure what transpired after that. It was a matter that the board was seized with many times in terms of reporting it to the board. To my knowledge, she said that all attempts with the minister had failed. That's all that she said. Our auditors at that time, when they picked up that there was a material irregularity by one of the executive or by an accounting authority, they felt that they need to put a matter of emphasis statement in their audit report that we were preparing for the financials, for the financial statement. What was important about this financial statement was that we needed them for our prospectus and a due diligence that we needed to do for us to be able to go and raise international bond overseas. And this was in around October. So it was very important that the board sign up on the financial statements. We would obviously then have a public announcement on the results, and then we would go out to the international market to raise funding. The board then decided that they would take the advice of the external auditors, that obviously as the board, they would like to make sure that the right thing is done, and they have been seized with the matter of how do they deal with this material irregularity. So they did put measures in place. It was approved by the board. In fact, a meeting was called to approve the financial statements with this matter of emphasis statement. However, what happened on the day of the committee, which was a few days before the results announcement, Mr. Zolatsotsi called me to say that he is going to cancel the meeting. The meeting can no longer happen, and I asked him why, because he knows that we need to go out on the to sign this result so that we can go out to the market. He said that it's because of pressure from outside, but he did not divulge what pressure that was. I then called all the board members and explained to them how important it was that they sign off on these financials before the results announcement, because we cannot have the results announcement if the auditors have not signed off, and therefore they must approve the financials. So the board members were aligned with my thinking. They supported me, and they said we will continue to have a board meeting without Mr. Zolatsotsi. The meeting did take place. Without Mr. Zolatsotsi, the board then decided they will select an alternative chairperson at the meeting, which they did. And the financial statements were then approved by the board at the time. However, what happened is that I think in terms of how the meeting was convened after Mr. Zolatsotsi had cancelled the meeting, I remember that he convened the meeting as the chairperson of the board, but then he called me to say that he is going to cancel the meeting, and he did cancel the meeting, but the board then decided that they will continue with the meeting. And unfortunately, there was a technicality from a process perspective in terms of how the second meeting was called, and it would appear that that meeting was null and void. And therefore, Mr. Zolatsotsi called me to inform me that the meeting that we had to approve the financials was null and void, and that he is having a discussion with the minister on the results announcement. The results announcement would be cancelled. But he was not aware that I was having a meeting with the minister myself at the time, and he wasn't at the meeting. So I then called the board members. I said, look, this is what has happened. The board then decided, no, we will meet and tonight, which was on a Monday, and they did approve the financials. So essentially that took place, yeah.
Can you just give us, you're mentioning two dates where the first was the technically invalid meeting where Mr. Tsotsi was not there. Then there was a second meeting, which was a successful meeting where the statements, annual financial statements, were now adopted. Can you give us those dates, please?
So the first meeting, if I recall, was around towards end of November. Forgive me if I don't remember exactly the dates. The results announcement was, I think, around the 5th of December. So the first meeting with the board members, which was a special board meeting to approve the results with a revised audit opinion, was on a Sunday. So that would have been around the 3rd or 2nd of December. The following meeting would have taken place on a Monday in the evening, which was a day before the results announcement. So it was probably around the 4th, yeah. I'm not sure if the results announcement was the 4th or 5th of December, yeah.
There will be minutes of board that will assist us with the dates.
There will be, Chair.
Just one last thing. You paint a picture of Mr. Tsotsi as somebody who abuses the law. When it suits what he wants to do, he uses the law. When the law does not suit what he wants to do, including the Constitution, which is the highest law in the land, he utterly disregards that. Is my observation of that accurate?
So, well, I really don't want to speculate, but my sense of what really transpired was that he was under pressure. And particularly because when I asked him why he wants to cancel the board meeting to sign off the financials, he indicated that he's under pressure from people outside. So I would say that it was probably because of pressure. I cannot really comment on whether it is in his nature to be able to, abdicate the law.
You were suspended, finally left Eskom. Can you take the committee through that? And that is my last question. Thank you, Chair.
I was suspended on the 11th of March alongside 3 other executives. When we were suspended, the board had 2 meetings. The first meeting was on the 9th of March, and I wish to indicate at this point that this was a new board. The board that had been deliberating on matters that I have just presented now to the committee had left in December 2014, with the exception of Mr. Zola Tsotsi and the exception of Ms. Chwayita Mabude. Those were the only board members that came back, and the rest of the board members were new to the committee, to the board of Eskom. When we were suspended, there was supposed to be a meeting on the 26th of February, which would have been the first board sitting, formal board sitting. And essentially, that board meeting was very important for us as well, because we had just concluded our business plan, which in terms of regulation needed to also be approved from a PFMA perspective, because we were submitting our funding plan and as well as the borrowing program. So that was important for us. However, that meeting, without any reason, was cancelled. We then had the next meeting called, if I may say so, by SMS on the night before, on the 8th, to say that there is an urgent meeting that's been called by the chairman, and we were asked to convene on the 9th of March. That meeting then was a special meeting wherein Mr. Zola Tsotsi informed the committee that he had been requested to do an investigation into the state of affairs of Eskom, specifically the financial challenges, the operational challenges, the delay in the bill program, and any other matters that the board or the minister was uncomfortable with. The board then felt that they have just stepped in. They are aware that the executive management is dealing with quite a lot of things. They do not support this investigation. It is only going to take time of the executive members when they should be dealing with day-to-day affairs. They then requested Mr. Tsotsi to call the minister and come and explain why it was important to have this inquiry, which is what it was called. The meeting was then adjourned shortly thereafter, and we would be informed on when the next meeting would be. The next time we were called by SMS again at night was on the 10th of March, where we were called to a meeting the following day to say that the minister may be coming to the meeting. We started the meeting with Mr. Tsidiso Matuna having just given his account of what his 150-day plan essentially is. And shortly thereafter, the Minister of Public Enterprises joined the meeting. And after she joined the meeting, obviously raised issues around the bugs that were in the boardrooms. There's a lot of leakages in the media, and he's been asking Mr. Matona to deal with those matters, and is not happy that they're not being dealt with decisively. We were then asked to recuse ourselves after that. It must have been after 30 minutes, around 10 o'clock in the morning. And the next time we were called in was later in the afternoon. Mr. Matuna was called first, and he was then told that he would be suspended. And I then was called after him, and I was informed that I would be suspended. I was actually issued with a letter of suspension that indicated that Eskom has decided to do, and the board of Eskom, has, on instruction from the minister, had decided to do an inquiry into the state of affairs. And because I'm the executive that is responsible for one of the matters that would be investigated, I'm being asked to step aside so that I do not interfere with the investigation process. What was interesting, however, was that they did say that we have done nothing wrong. However, should we not provide our laptop devices and so forth, further disciplinary measures would be taken against us. So it was quite confusing at that time to say we have not done anything wrong. You're asking us to step aside. However, there will be further disciplinary measures against us for not complying. So we then signed the letters. It was then very clear on the following day when Mr. Tsotsi was on the news that there was an inquiry. We were informed that the inquiry would take 3 months, but 2 months into the suspensions, we had still not heard from the board on whether the inquiry had started, what were the terms of reference, because we were informed that we should be we would actually be called to testify into the inquiry. So I think one can understand that we needed to know. We're 2 months into the process. The inquiry hasn't started. You said to us we would be called back in 3 months' time, but we haven't started. Shortly thereafter, I started engaging my lawyers. I started asking Eskom questions around what are the terms of reference of these, the inquiry, when do we expect to be called? And I was getting responses intermittently, and I kept on writing to them. Eventually, they called me to have a discussion with me around an amicable exit from the organization. And in that view, they felt that we probably have reached a point where we could no longer be able to work together, considering the fact that the investigation would also take some time. So it was probably best for both of us to part ways and that I continue with my career. And that's what essentially happened.
While I'm identifying hands, ma'am, you can stretch if you like. Members, I'm taking hands now. Honorable Luyenge, Honorable Mazone, Honorable Swart, Honorable Khaula, Honorable Mare, Honorable Tseli, Honorable Godan, Honorable Kungubele. I might mix. Oh, Honorable Nobanda. I might move around the names sometime. Can you attend to that? Can you attend to that? We'll attend to it. Thank you, members. Parliament communications. Okay. Right. Shall we begin? Are you?
Thank you, thank you, Chairperson. Let me first appreciate the presentation or the testimony by you, ma'am, and also the fact that you were bold enough to say, after having read and heard a lot about the citizens of South Africa crying foul on what they perceive to be happening at Eskom. Having you been part of the leadership at Eskom, and of course under the governance leadership by the board, which I believe Mr. Tsotsi was the chairperson in that period. Can I maybe check as to, since when did you realize the fact that the directives or the communication between the acting group chief executive and the board were in any way unscrupulous? What was the general norm, or what was the normal communication channel between the board and the management? When there was the first meeting, which I believe, or rather on the 8th, where Mr. Tsotsi convened a meeting, the one through an SMS, where a suggestion that there be an investigation or inquiry about certain aspects at Eskom, where actually did you become unsettled about that kind of an investigation? And who was meant to be the champion of that investigation, or under which auspices? Was that going to be done by the management, or was that going to be done by the board? Now, after having been suspended, is it normal on your part that you get suspended in a meeting, or that was a discussion about what should happen and you were supposed to actually discuss that and put your view as to whether it will be appropriate to suspend some of you? And lastly, was the minister part of the meeting that resolved on the suspensions? If that was the case, was that normal, or does that covered was it appropriate that it happens in that fashion? Is there any appeal that you made or communication to the department as it pertains to your suspension before you engaged the lawyers? And were you responded to satisfactorily, if you were responded to? Thank you, Chair.
It's your turn, ma'am. When you are ready.
I think on the first question, when did I realize the fact that the directive between the chairperson and the board themselves were in any way unscrupulous? I guess since the board came in, there were always questions about, having experienced how the previous board was removed. There were always suspicions about what is the board coming here to do. And the issue, I think, from management and the board perhaps, and probably it was mutual, was for a while there was an element of mistrust between the board and executives. The board probably felt, we have been informed that management needs to step up, or we are not comfortable with how things are done. On the other hand, we also did not understand, especially because of how the board was appointed, what was the issue. So when we had just done our strategy review, because if I recall, the chief executive at the time had just stepped in, and I think probably less than 2 years in his role, he obviously requested a strategy review of the company to make sure that we turn around the company, alongside the financial director at the time, Mr. Paulo Flati. So we had gone through a thorough process of going through the strategy review, and we were ready for implementation, and we had been sharing plans with the shareholder as well. So there was a time when, as we were about to start executing on the new strategy, we had to stop because the new board felt that they need to obviously socialize themselves with what we were doing. And I think that created some discomfort on the side of the executives, that, we know that what we need to do. There are a lot of things that need to be done. And if I recall, I think we probably went through almost a period of 5 months of not being able to implement the strategy because the board obviously was new. They needed to familiarize themselves with what we wanted to do and obviously go through new approvals as the board. I think one of the issues was obviously that the perception that had been made around executives was executives were resisting transformation. And that was really, even as I said initially, my discussion with Mr. Machila as the board tender chair, and I was the EXCO, was always to provide assurance that we have plans in place. We've got an enterprise supply development program in place to make sure that we take transformation seriously, to show that we take transformation seriously. So there were always issues around how we do things. Do we have good intentions? We then questioned, do they have good intentions? Why are we always asked about transformation as though we have nothing in place? And I guess it was that kind of relationship for a while. But just as we thought we probably found our feet, we obviously had various resignations, which obviously on my part took me by surprise. Mr. Brian Dames left. Mr. Paulo Flati had just left, not having even completed 3 years in the company. And so one questioned what is really going on. One could understand probably Mr. Flati, we did not know the reasons that he left. But on the day that I was appointed was actually on the day that Mr. Brian Dames' resignation was announced, which was obviously unsettling for me. So I think because of that, one didn't understand what is really going on because nobody was talking. I think the way that it became was that even the executives themselves probably did not know who to trust, who to speak to. You know, if I speak to so-and-so, are they going to tell the board? If I ask this question, and I think it was becoming toxic at some point because of that. So there was very little information sharing on some of these, you know, soft health issues within the organization that created a lot of tension between the board and the executives and among the executives themselves.
That's the last one follow-up, Chair. Having gone through your academic qualifications, especially in public administration, you seem to be there. One of the principles of public administration, the one of a political administrative dichotomy that requires the doctrine and the phenomenon working together, an interface between the two. Do you think that exists in Eskom?
Look, I think Eskom had quite a number of challenges. I think we were almost mindful of that. In fact, there were initiatives that were started because much as, you know, there were issues between ourselves, but we had to work together for the good of the company. And I think there were a lot of initiatives, and as I say, these things could be personality issues, trust issues, and so forth. So it was very important that we understand why is there lack of trust? Why can we not obviously put things together for the good? So we actually, the chairman and the CEO at the time decided that we would have initiatives for interventions rather that would help us as the board and the executive management, being the EXCO at the time, to go through what are some of the issues that we are dealing with that are creating tension. How do we then move forward? So we did have facilitated sessions by independent people to just help us around this. So there were efforts. So I think it was recognized that there are issues. Efforts were made, but I think because there was change as well in management and obviously change in the board, some of these things did not obviously go through to be completed.
You're welcome. Honorable Mozen, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being here today. My name is Natasha Mazzoni. I think that fundamentally there's a bigger problem at play here than just what we've been able to touch on regarding your suspension. Because it seems from your testimony that there were inherent